Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you're watching from. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which aside from me, includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. We can all agree this has been quite a week, and as Peter Baker just said, and it's only Monday. Last Thursday's debate and its implications on the election has dominated the headlines, opinion pages, and most of our conversations over the last 4 days. And of course, today's ruling is, our heads are spinning. What can I say? We are extremely grateful to have two extraordinarily knowledgeable and smart guests tonight to give us their thoughts and help us sort through our own anxieties and even confusion about the debate and its fallout, and maybe a few words about today's ruling. Many thanks to Peter Baker and to Lynn Vavreck for agreeing to be with us tonight, and of course to Larry Mantle for what we know will be his expert moderating of tonight's program. I wish everybody here as much as possible a happy July 4th. We need to celebrate our country. There will be no additional program this week in observance of July 4th. Next Wednesday, July 10th, we will feature Professor Steve Zipperstein, who is an expert on the international legal aspects of the war in Gaza. It'll be another great program helping us gain further insight into an understanding of the Israel-Hamas war. Reminder, all of our programs are available via podcast and via our YouTube channel and our website. Links to our past programs are in every single email we send, and you know we send plenty of them. So if you go to any email, you will find a link to the podcast or to past events, and you can find any of our past 215 programs. Now, to introduce our speakers and moderator, please welcome my longtime friend, a vital member of our leadership team, the former Los Angeles County Supervisor, Zev Yaroslavsky. Zev?
Thank you, Janice. We're really privileged tonight to have two outstanding guests to discuss the postmortem on last Thursday's presidential debate and events that have ensued since then. UCLA professor Lynn Vavreck and journalist Peter Baker. There aren't two more qualified people to discuss this subject at this moment that we occupy. Lynn Vavreck is the Marvin Hoffenberg Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA. She is a contributing columnist to the Upshot at the New York Times and is a recipient of the Andrew F. Carnegie Prize in the Humanities and Social Sciences. Lynn is the author of 5 books, including what has been called the most ominous book in about the 2016 election, called Identity Crisis, the 2016 Presidential Campaign and the Battle for the Meaning of America. Political consultants on both sides of the aisle refer to her work on political messaging as required reading for presidential candidates. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Rochester and held previous appointments at Princeton University, Dartmouth, and the White House. Lynn has served on the advisory boards of both the British and American National Election Studies. She teaches courses on campaigns, elections, public opinion, and the 1960s. She is a walking encyclopedia on American presidential politics. A native of Cleveland, Ohio, she remains a loyal Cleveland Browns fan. I'm still working on her on that. Peter Baker is chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and political analyst for MSNBC. Prior to these posts, he spent 20 years with the Washington Post. He has covered 5 presidencies from Bill Clinton through Joe Biden. Together with his wife, Susan Glasser of The New Yorker, who has also appeared on America at a Crossroads as our guest, he spent 4 years in Moscow working for the Washington Post, chronicling the rise of Vladimir Putin. Peter also covered the early months of the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq from both of those countries. And while with the New York Times, he also served as a lead reporter in its Jerusalem bureau. Baker has written 7 books, most recently together with Susan Glasser. He wrote The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021. His son Theo is a Stanford student where he's an investigative reporter for the Stanford Daily, the campus newspaper. And last year, Theo became the youngest winner of the prestigious, very prestigious George Polk Award in journalism, which is awarded for intrepid, bold, and influential reporting. His story exposed unethical research on the part of Stanford's president, causing the president to resign. As the old saying goes, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Our moderator tonight is one of America's most respected broadcast journalists, Larry Mantle. Larry is no stranger to us. He is in his 40th year as host of Air Talk on public radio's LAist, formerly KPCC in Southern California. It is America's longest running radio talk show, which should tell us all we need to know about Larry Mantle. Larry is a regular interlocutor on our programs, and we are privileged and grateful for his partnership. Larry, the floor is yours.
Zev, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here for America at a Crossroads, particularly this week coming off the extraordinary events of last Thursday evening's debate, and of course, all the conversation in Washington around the country in response to that. And to echo what you said and Janice said, I can't think of two better experts to join us this evening. Peter Baker, of course, to share from inside the White House. What kinds of conversations are taking place? What sorts of disagreements are we hearing about? And of course, Lynn Vavreck, the tremendous analysis, the ability to look at historical precedents and to make sense of highly complex themes, as well as data from polling and from historical records to be able to bring us a sense of what's unfolding today. Lynn and Peter, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much. Peter, let me start with that inside expertise as White House correspondent that you bring us. Those closest to President Biden are insisting in the aftermath of the debate that this is not an impaired president, that this is not someone less capable of making difficult decisions, responding in high-stress moments, processing information quickly and coming to a strong conclusion, that skill is not diminished, despite what we saw in that studio in Atlanta last Thursday. Are there people within the president's inner circle that are pushing back on that messaging?
Yeah, thank you for having me, by the way. What a great treat to be here. I've had a couple opportunities to do this program before, and I'm always delighted to share the conversation with such great people as Larry and Lynn. And I know it's a great audience as well, which I think speaks highly of Janice and the whole organization. Yeah, it's a remarkable moment in the Biden presidency. It's a remarkable moment in the White House. I've covered it now going back to 1996. I've never seen anything quite like what we've seen in the last few days. You're right that the Biden people are telling us not to worry, not to believe our own eyes in some ways. Their strategy seems to be much like, as my friend Mike Shear wrote the other day, the policeman at the car wreck who says, nothing to see here, move on. It's just one debate, and let's not take too much out of it. But the problem for the Biden White House at this point is that people, Americans and Democratic professionals alike, have had real concerns about the president's age going back now for a year or two. And the Biden White House has told them that there wasn't anything to see. And now they seem to have discovered it on their own screens in their own living rooms. And it's hard to kind of wipe that out of their memory tracks. They're not going to be able to do that. So it's a really volatile moment. We don't know whether the president's going to stay in the race. They say at the moment he is. I think he's likely to, but I don't know that that's a definite thing. I think it's still an open question. One Biden person I talked to said, I know what today's decision is. I just don't know what tomorrow's decision is going to be. So it'll depend in part on how polls come back in these next few days, particularly for downstate candidates in red state areas. They're going to be, if they see their numbers cratering, that will change things. It'll be interesting to see what the donors do. Tonight, they had a call just a few minutes ago on the National Finance Committee in which they tried to hold their donors with them and tell them not to panic too much. We'll see how well that works, because if the donor money dries up, that will tell us another thing. So it is a volatile moment right now at the White House, and we don't know where it's going to end up tomorrow or at the end of the week.
We'll come back to this, but Lynn, I wanted to ask you about anything at all historic we can look to that harkens back to this moment we face now.
Well, I want to echo Peter's thanks for having me back. It's great to be here. I think there are a lot of ways we could think about what's the historical precedent for this moment. But I think what Peter said is right. Like, this is such an unusual time, and it's unusual on so many dimensions. Like, I don't even know which crossroad we're at right now. You know, we were talking about the convictions, and then we were talking about the debate performance, and then, you know, now it's, I believe I just saw the story in the Times that Trump is filing to have the convictions, you know, overturned because of the immunity ruling. There's like a new crossroad every 10 seconds. So there's no precedent for sort of the place that we're in. But there's lots of precedent for when things go wrong in campaigns, what happens. And so you might think back to maybe such years as 1988, when things were going bad for Michael Dukakis. Okay, let's blame it on the staff, clear them out, bring in a whole new set of people, and have a reboot. So the reboot is always an option for a candidate when things seem to have gone awry. So that's something we've seen other candidates do. Another possibility that comes to mind for me is this idea of waiting on the polls. I think this is not a good strategy. Reacting to one poll right after something has happened is never a good indicator of what's going to happen in November. So that's not to say that Biden should, stick it out or not. But this idea that whatever these next set of polls are, that's really going to give them high quality information, I think that's problematic too.
But Lynn, he's got another debate to go. And so unless they really believe that he's going to come out and perform significantly better than he did Thursday, then that's just going to remind people of the condition that the president is in. And,
okay. I like how you're thinking. I like how you're thinking, Larry. Like you're thinking like a scientist. So we have September 10th is the next debate. So if this debate produces bad polls in the week after, then the one on September 10th is going to produce bad polls right when people are starting to early vote. And those won't be polls, those will be votes. So that is a concern. Hopefully that's how they're thinking about it.
And Lynn, who are the voters that are in play? I mean, it would seem people who could vote for either of these candidates, you've got a minority of Americans in that position. They at some degree are willing to live or to entertain the idea of living with all the fantastical and outlandish and deceptive things that the former president said in the Thursday debate, or potentially to live with the diminished Joe Biden that we saw in Thursday's debate. So what factors do you think are for those voters who feel at some level they might be able to overlook one or the other? What is potentially decisive for those folks?
Well, that's the $1 million question. I think where you started the question is really important. There are not that many of those people. Now, on the one hand, maybe that makes us exhale a little bit, but then I'm going to hit you with the second most important thing. These elections are turning on very, very few votes. So we are talking in 2016, 77,000 votes in 3 states. In 2020, roughly half that many votes in 3 states. There is no reason to think that the 2024 presidential election won't be fewer votes still. So there are very few people to convince, but they could be pivotal. And so the question of what is really going to draw them to one side or the other, or draw them out to participate at all, that is what everybody wants to know. And what I can tell you about these undecided voters, historically speaking, is not shocking. They're not aliens. So they are people who live in America, who have voted in other elections, and they do have a sense of their partisanship, even though they may go one way or the other way, depending on maybe you want to vote for Barack Obama in 2008 for one reason or another. And then maybe you say, oh, I'm going to try out the other side in 2016 because I like this idea about X, Y, or Z. So it really is the moment and meeting these people where they are and understanding what they might be going through. And that's a little bit where I think the last couple of days have been problematic for the president and his team.
I'm going to go a little bit back and forth with the two of you because sort of the issue of the political science, but also the very personal side of this for Joe Biden. And Peter, I want to go back to Biden's family because I think there were a lot of us. I mean, you know Joe Biden so much better than I do, but I've had probably talked with him for well over an hour over the course of the years. I have a little sense of him, and he's someone I've enjoyed speaking to. Seeing him Thursday night, and I don't know whether you had this reaction, I had a very visceral reaction. I felt I almost protective And I wonder how his family looks at this. And again, you know, however couples deal with their relationships, that's their business. Everybody has their own dynamic. I say this not meaning to be judgmental, but I just think for myself, it would be so difficult for me to see a spouse or parent in that position up there like he was on Thursday night. Do you get any sense that there are concerns along those lines from the Biden family?
Yeah, I think Thursday night was a painful night for the family. They recognize how it went and they recognize how he looked. And of course, you're right. They not only love and care about him, they love and care about his legacy, and they want him to be remembered as the vigorous, dynamic, accomplished president, not as the guy who fumbled through a debate and then lost an election to Donald Trump of all people. And so there's a really very painful moment in a sense for the family. Now, the family was together at Camp David this weekend. They had planned that before the debate, but it certainly obviously had allowed the president to be with the people he cared about most at a moment of crisis for him and the family. And we're told that the family is pretty strongly telling him, stay in, fight it out. That's what you've always done throughout your life. Remember, of course, Biden's political persona is built on the idea of adversity and, you know, comeback, basically. He's done that time and time again. It is fair to say that the family may be the only people in his orbit who really matter in terms of the advice he's going to listen to, because I don't think that a lot of the political people matter too much to him. There are very few people who are his peers anymore. He got in the Senate, remember, in 1972, and not a lot of those people are still around today who he would respect and whose opinion he might value. There are a handful of people who might be able to tell him, you know, look, Joe, for your own sake, for the country, for the sake of your legacy, maybe this isn't the time to go forward. But there are not that many outside of his family. And that's why I think the family's decision to stay with him strongly, and we're told by a person very close to the family that the family is, quote, entirely united, that's meaningful at this point.
Peter, what do you think would be the effect if the campaign and maybe even the president himself came out and said, look, there are times where I have to process information very, very quickly, stay up with what's happening. It takes me longer. And the debate was an environment where I could not operate at that speed. Nonetheless, I'm able, under pressure, based on my experience, my cognitive skills are still strong. I'm still in a position to govern and to make these decisions. And to kind of, you know, on the one hand, on the other, and to be a bit more open about, instead of just sort of circling the wagons, no, everything's okay.
I think that's one of the reasons they've gotten into this position in the first place, because they were in complete denial, in effect, that there was any problem at all. And it didn't seem very plausible to people who saw him every day. It didn't seem very plausible to many Americans who saw him even on television. I think a lot of what we saw on Thursday night is a more exaggerated, more pronounced version of what we have seen now going back a year or two. It hasn't been that bad. It hasn't been that dramatic. But we have seen him, you know, exhibit what we call senior moments. And I think you're right that candor is obviously a route that they haven't taken. And he hasn't really sort of owned up to it and tried to address it in a forthright way. He did a decent amount of that the next day at a rally in Raleigh. He says, look, I am not a young man. I do not walk as fast as I used to or as well as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to, but I tell the truth and I'm better than Donald Trump, in effect, is what he said. And that's an argument that they're going to have to try to make more, you know, repeatedly, I think. But I agree with you. They have not really addressed the question, and they're discussing how to do that. They may have a news conference. They may have a town hall meeting. They may have some interviews. You could imagine some sort of a soft show kind of interview for an evening program or something like that, in which he could be more proactive about saying, yeah, you're right. I get it. I'm older. There's some problems when you're older and I have issues, but here's how we address it. And I'm still making the decisions that matter for you as Americans on policies that you care about, like healthcare and taxes and so forth. But they haven't done that yet, because I think that it's a hard subject for him. I don't think he likes the idea of being called old. He said publicly, I don't even like to talk about it. And I think that hasn't helped him prepare for a moment like Thursday.
And that's understandable. That's pretty common feeling people have. Lynn, what do you think from a strategic perspective would be a stronger way for the president's team to go? Or do you think they're making the best they can of a difficult circumstance?
I don't think they're making the best they can of a difficult circumstance, but I also don't know. It's at this point where they've landed, I think, is it's a gamble either way. And that is just where we are. And so I can't even get my head around which one of these gambles I myself would bet $5 on or even $5,000 on. I don't know, because this is so unusual, to have, this is sort of what Peter was just talking about, to put your candidate in an election that you yourself have been saying is the election where democracy is on the ballot. For that team and the family and the candidate to have put themselves in a position where the number one thing that everyone was worried about, especially in the wake of, a very nice man with a failing memory, in the wake of that, to put someone in the position where they were going to reveal that in fact is the truth about them. It's just, I can't even imagine how you get to this point.
Well, and Peter was talking about, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Lynn.
No, I was just going to say, so here we are. Okay, there's this tempting idea that, and if you follow your favorite, former White House employees on Twitter, you'll know there's a set of people who are out there saying, when we were in the White House, our team would have done this. And it is very tempting to say this is the moment to scoop up those undecided voters we were just talking about by bringing in the right, younger, more energetic, sort of love of your life candidate, once in a lifetime opportunity kind of to write history and scoop those undecided voters up to be part of something, part of the solution, part of what gets us out of this calcification and polarization. You want to be a part of that? Come on, this is your candidate, this is your chance. Like, it's very tempting to think this is what could happen, but that is not what would happen. It would still be a slog, and that's a person who hasn't been tested on the national stage. And we're going to start testing them in July when, it's just, this is not ideal.
Well,
so
but
I don't know.
Let me throw a candidate out. I was actually going to bring up Peter talking about them maybe holding more news conference to get your thought on that, but I'll follow up on what you just said about, on America to Crossroads, we had Governor Whitmer of Michigan, and I had the honor of interviewing her. She's very impressive. She is very quick on her feet, has tremendous mastery of different issues to talk about. If you took someone like her, and I was thinking about the Obama candidacy, where when Obama ran, he had the advantage of not having a very long senatorial career. There wasn't so much to go after him, and it enabled people to project onto him what they thought he was or what they wanted him to be. Now, that meant he disappointed some people in how he actually governed, but it opened up the door for a pretty broad cross-section of Democrats to embrace the former president. If you had someone like a Governor Whitmer who didn't have that sort of a track record, that's extensive to go after, and who we know is quick on her feet, how big a risk would that really be?
Well, we don't know. You think about, there's just all this weird stuff that comes out when the opposition starts digging around in your past. A couple of years ago, there was a candidate who it was revealed weeks and weeks and weeks into a presidential campaign. Oh, he had stabbed someone in a bathroom at a gas station. I don't know if you guys remember that. There are these odd moments that just get revealed, and so there is something to be said for a candidate whose mettle has been tested, who has beaten this opponent in the past. But the question is that who this Joe Biden is? Is he still that candidate? So I hear what you're saying, Larry, and I don't know if that would be a good gamble.
Well, and we can talk about what it would even take if you provided that the president stepped aside. And Peter, that would have to happen, right? I mean, I can't imagine what it would look like if he was really pressured against his will to get out of the race. Is that even possible?
I don't see, and nobody I've talked to sees any scenario in which they replace Joe Biden over his objection. Okay. He controls all 3,900 delegates that are going to be voting in the Democratic National Convention. They're pledged to him to vote on the first ballot. There's no scenario that I see and anybody else raised in which he could be deposed against his will. Now, he could be pressured into agreeing to step down or step aside, of course, and that may happen. I don't think it's likely. That's the way it feels right now, but it is not a zero chance either. And I think that that's something we need to keep in mind. Now, if that were to happen, you're right. It opens up the door. Lynn's exactly right to use the word gamble. I think gamble is the way people are looking at it right now. You're going to roll the dice. So which roll of the dice are you willing to take? This is what I hear from donors and strategists. Are you going to roll the dice on Biden, who may not be able to win at this point, who may have been fatally compromised, but you know who he is and you know what he's about, and there's no real surprises there anymore? Or do you roll the dice on, as Lynn says, somebody who may be a complete surprise? Gretchen Whitmer may be very impressive. Gavin Newsom may be impressive. Kamala Harris may be impressive, but they now would have the clear lights of the national political world on them in a way that you don't get in California or Michigan or any other state. And we don't know what would turn up. Everybody thought on the Republican side that Ron DeSantis was a star. They thought he was awesome. They were really excited about him.
Right.
Once you get out on the road, turns out not so great. At least
That's
not
a very good point
and,
to raise.
And it happens. If you can think in your mind of other people who were just like that, who everybody was sure were going to be great. And then they get out there. Presidential campaigns are hard. Long days, no sleep, different place all the time, bad food or no food, and it's like, that is not for everybody, and people they crumble.
Obama was the exception, I think, that proved the rule. He was the one guy who ran, I think, pretty much a flawless campaign with one or two exceptions. And you pretty much had to be, I think, to be the first African-American elected president. And he really did. And nobody else I've seen in modern politics ran a flawless campaign. Everybody made mistakes. And the question is how they recovered from them and improved themselves. And I think you're right. And in this case, we have such a short amount of time, right? It's not just the convention at the end of August. It's actually August 7th. Because remember, the Democratic National Committee has now scheduled the roll call to take place before the convention. That may sound weird, but it's going to take place on August 7th. Why? Because of an Ohio law that says you can't be on the ballot unless your name is submitted to Ohio before the date that the Democratic Convention is going to be held. So they have to have this vote early in order to be on the Ohio ballot. Well, August 7th, by the way, guys, is 5 weeks away. That's a very short, truncated, primary campaign, if you will. It's not a primary campaign, but a convention campaign in effect, if you have the president step down tomorrow.
Lynn, I wanted to ask you about, what it would even take. You've got these pledged delegates for the president. If the president were to decide that he was going to step aside, then what would happen at the convention?
Well, now that Peter has told us that the roll call has to happen before the convention even starts, it's not even clear to me. I assume it'll just be a plenary session, and they'll call
the pre-convention or wherever.
Yeah,
this
right,
would take place.
Yes, yeah. Every academic's worst fear, the pre-conference conference. And I am not an expert on this, but please, you guys help me out with what you suspect would happen too. But the delegates would be released, and I assume they would be free to vote their conscience, which I believe is actually already in their charge. I think that their charge says something like the intention is for you to vote for the candidate who you're pledged to, and then I think there's something about using your conscience. So, I suppose they could collude, the delegates could collude and say, we don't think this is the right way to go, even if the president hasn't stepped aside. That's probably not happening. So say he does, then they, but as Peter said, it's 5 weeks. And so if this is what is going to happen, a major coordination campaign has to start, fast. Because you've got to get all of those delegates on the same page. And what you don't want to fight at the convention, is it going to be Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer? You don't want that fight at the pre-convention.
We as journalists would actually love that, because that's when conventions were actually much more entertaining. They weren't just scripted PR affairs.
Yes. Well, it hasn't, when it comes to that, it hasn't always gone well, historically speaking. So, so the more we talk about it here, the more I really am coming to appreciate that, this is a big gamble.
Back to the question I was going to ask you earlier, Lynn, Peter was talking about the potential of having more news conferences. The president and his team have avoided them. I think this is the fewest that a president has had, and there have been consistent criticisms of that from the press corps. But seeing how he responded Thursday night, obviously a president can control a press conference easier than a debate, but it's still that on your feet. You lose your train of thought. It's going to stand out like a sore thumb. Lynn, if you were advising, do you think news conferences would make sense for him?
Not a chance. Not a chance. I mean, I don't know. Peter's in the room. Like, is it easier than a debate? I don't think it can be. In a debate, you have your 5 talking points that you're going to get out. No matter what the question is, I'm going to hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you know your opening and you know your closing. And you know what zingers you might want to get in there too. At a press conference, I don't know what Peter Baker's going to ask me. I don't know, Peter, it's harder, right?
Well, it's interesting. It's a good question. I hadn't made the comparison before, but it is hard, obviously, in different ways, right? You're right, because, it's easier in some ways at a debate to go against somebody, right? You're against Donald Trump. This is all the reasons my opponent stinks. And, you can prepare all those lines. You're not supposed to attack the press. I mean, you do a little bit, but that's not the whole point of the exercise. And you have to be able to be nimble on your feet. And you're right. You don't necessarily know what's going to be asked. So it's a different challenge, but he could do it during daytime, which, by the way, would be easier maybe than a nighttime debate. There is that. And I think the question, though, is, I I understand your point. It's my job as a reporter to say he should do the news conference. Larry, you're exactly right that he has done fewer news conferences. I got the latest numbers today, as a matter of fact. As of today, he has done fewer news conferences than any president to this point in their presidency since Ronald Reagan. And he's done fewer interviews than every president in the modern era, including Ronald Reagan. And I'll tell you this, he's given no interviews to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the USA Today, Politico, no print organization.
Super Bowl. He turned down the Super Bowl interview, which is about as puff an interview as a president can get.
What is this about? What is this about? Can you guys in the profession tell me? What is this about?
It's assumed as it's about protecting him for what happened on Thursday, right?
See, that's bad.
The assumption has always been that if they give interviews, he's going to stumble and he'll look bad. And they haven't quite said that. But when we've talked about getting an interview and they've, given us a stiff arm, they make very clear that what they don't want is for us to write a story about how he doesn't respond in a lucid.
Right.
So, it's really in that way not that complicated. When he does do interviews, they tend to be with friendly interviewers, celebrities, let's say, late night talk show hosts, people who might not necessarily be as tough on him as they fear that the mainstream press would be.
So I think this is really weird because his superpower is supposed to be empathy, right? He is the guy who can look at you and understand you and really connect with you. And I just think that if he were going to sit down with you, he could do that with you. I mean, he is good at it. And
well, I have to say, even just to your point, Lynn, 4 years ago when I interviewed him during the campaign, it was clear he had lost a step. He was, I could tell that even 4 years ago, but he was still, total charm offensive. And Larry, like all the things a good politician does. And I have to say, as always, I was so impressed with what a great politician he is and how strong a campaigner he could be. So to your point, he's historically had those skills in abundance. But the question is, can he still draw on those? Peter, do you think?
I have to say that he is not the person he was 4 years ago. Now, none of us is. I've got a birthday tomorrow. I just assume not have it. But we all are getting older. But there is a demonstrable difference between today and 4 years ago. Look at the debate tapes from 4 years ago versus not just even Thursday, but even just everyday appearances that he makes, and you'll notice the difference. And I notice it seeing him every day. Now, does that mean he can't do the job? That's obviously a question the voters will have to answer. It's certainly true that when we talk to people who are in the room with him, they'll tell you that he, at most points, is asking sharp questions and understands and grasps the complicated issues and makes, what they at least consider to be wise decisions, at least the decisions he would have made that 10 years ago when he was younger, that nobody has yet identified to me a decision that he made that he wouldn't have made had he not been 81. But it's certainly true that he has presented more in a more frail and fragile way, in a physical way, and increasingly, I think, in a way where he is forgetful of names or mixing up dates and so forth. How meaningful that is, again, that's something people will have to decide for themselves. But there's no question that there's been some change.
We're getting closer to our time for viewer questions, but I do want to ask about this morning's U.S. Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. Just before we came on the air this evening, the president spoke very briefly from the White House, in which he condemned the U.S. Supreme Court. And there have been tremendous criticism of the Supreme Court conservative majority decision, which said that official acts of the president are granted immunity under the Constitution. The question then is, what is an official act versus what's not? Peter, what is your sense of any potential impact of this on the presidential election? One obvious one is the president's not going to face that federal trial before the election, but anything else?
Yeah, there are I would say three quick impacts here. One, you're right. This basically means we're not going to see Trump on trial until after the election. And if he wins, we'll never see him on trial on the election subversion or the classified documents cases. He'll make those go away. Two, it gives President Biden actually a little bit of a breather today, because it means we're talking about something other than his age and other than the debate. And we're talking about, and it's sort of a reminder of the larger questions at stake here is, do you want Donald Trump to be back in the White House? Do you want Donald Trump emboldened by immunity back in the White House? Remember, he's already been impeached twice without result. He's already been indicted 4 times and convicted 1 time, and it hasn't actually hurt him politically, it seems like, at least not in a significant way. And so if he's back in the White House and he doesn't have the establishment Republicans around him that he did in the first term, but instead the more MAGA, determined people around him, what's going to be the check on his power? And that's, I think, an important change or an important conversation point in this election. And the third thing is, I think, put aside Trump and put aside Biden, is we've now redefined our democracy today in a meaningful way. For 250 years, every president was in there thinking, well, he could be indicted if he did something wrong. And now we've told them, no, actually, you're okay. And it's not just official acts in the sense of like, okay, of course, you're not going to indict a president because he signed a bill you don't like or he issued an order you don't like. In this case, they specifically said, for instance, that Trump's conversations with the Justice Department, when he tried to get the Justice Department to lie and say there were problems with the election that they were not seeing, that's okay. That's an official act. That's not an act of corruption. That's an official act. So now any president can call the Justice Department and say basically anything, because they've just said specifically, you can call the Justice Department, anything you say basically is an official act. So I can call the Justice Department if I'm president and say, prosecute Larry Mantle, prosecute Lynn Vavreck. It doesn't matter if they have done any crimes or not. I want you to prosecute them. And that's totally fine under this ruling. So I think that's a big change in our democracy and the way we conceive of an executive at this point.
And of course, the president could still be impeached and removed from office for those acts.
We've already learned that can't happen, because as long as the sitting president's party has at least 1/3 of the Senate, it just won't happen. And by the way, I look at this, I don't think in our history, the incumbent president's party has never had less than 1/3. So there's never been a Congress in our history, and I don't think that we can imagine that there will be one in which the opposition party has more than 2/3, which is what you require for a conviction.
Lynn, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that all of the conversation about the uniqueness of Joe Biden in this moment, the uniqueness of the Supreme Court ruling and how it relates to Trump and his trials. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is those are sort of the players in the game. And we haven't talked at all about the playing field. And I think we just take, 20 seconds to talk about the field that we're on, which is the sort of landscape of macro politics at the moment. What field are we playing on? We are playing on a field where the the two political parties are very homogenous within each party. Democrats are more like one another. Republicans are more like one another than they have been in the last, 70 years since the New Deal. A field on which the two parties are farther apart than they've ever been. So there's a lot of distance between the two worlds that each of the parties wants to build. And 90% of Americans will tell you that they see very clear and important differences between those two political parties. And so people know they want to build different worlds, and they know which world they prefer. And so all of that means Joe Biden can be older than he was 4 years ago. He can mix up names and dates. Those people who are voting for him, they're not crossing over to vote for Donald Trump. It's a bridge too far. It's too far away. And the same thing with Republicans, 34 felony convictions, twice impeached, don't like his attitude, don't like his demeanor, don't like him, but I'm not crossing over to vote for the other guy. That's a world I don't want to live in. It's too far away. We're not fighting anymore about whether the tax rate should be 35 or 37%. And if we compromise at 36, okay. The worlds we're fighting over are really different worlds. So that's the playing field. And so while this is historically significant, in terms of how it's affecting the election to come, I think not as much as it feels like it should.
Lynn, fascinating. Thanks so much. Let's go to some viewer questions. Let's see. Jane asks, why do you think that President Biden agreed to debate Trump? With Trump so skillful at telling lies, how did Biden ever, or his team ever, think that a debate could be advantageous to him? Lynn, you want to take that first?
Well, I think they probably thought that the previous debates went okay for them. They won. So they were thinking historically, we've beat this guy before. We are the only Democrat who has beaten him. And so we'll do it again. I also think that the State of the Union, the last two State of the Union addresses, I think have been great. Thought they were really well-delivered, well-written speeches, and they got great reactions from people. And so maybe that made them think that this was sort of the next public-facing thing that was going to be the same as those State of the Unions. And then the last thing I'll say on this is, I bet they were a little surprised at how the room felt to Joe Biden without anybody in it. I think that decision not to have an audience there, as a college professor, I can tell you, think about, I stand up in front of 400 freshmen at UCLA and I give a lecture, and I am definitely pivoting a little more explanation here. If I see they're not getting it, breeze past all of this because they're, shopping on Amazon, I can tell, so I'm gauging what I'm giving depending on what I'm receiving. If I were giving that lecture to an empty room, I promise you it would be flatter. And I bet it was the same for Biden, who, as you guys have described, is different than he was 4 or 8 years ago. The audience actually may be more important to him, engaging how fast he should be talking, how long he should be explaining things. And that might have caught them by surprise.
That's such a fascinating thing, Lynn, because had I been an advisor of the president, I would have been concerned with the crowd that would have been a little distracting for him, because those crowds tend to erupt at different points. You got to change the cadence. And so I would have been a little concerned. It would have been hard for him to react. But your point about the energy level is a very good one. Peter, the question again from Jane, our viewer, why do you think they agreed to do it?
Yeah, all the reasons that Lynn just said. I think the other thing is that, look, he's been mired in not great polls, right? He's either tied or behind slightly nationally and in the battleground states. And they wanted to tell voters, they wanted to make voters understand, yes, this is your choice. Okay. You may not be happy with it. You may think that neither Biden nor Trump is great, but this is it. Don't think somebody else is coming along. These are your choices. And that if the choice is between Biden and Trump, remember why you didn't like him 4 years ago. So they thought they could recast the contest by having this debate, by getting through to Americans who still had this idea in their heads that there would be another nominee. And of course, it worked the exact opposite. Instead, it actually opened up the question again of whether Biden would be the nominee. And it didn't, in fact, solidify that choice that he wanted to make. He wanted to make a choice, not a referendum, but instead, right now, it feels like a referendum, and a referendum on him, and one that he's not winning.
We have many of our viewers who said, while Biden's performance was poor, he wasn't unethical, he wasn't mean-spirited, he wasn't full of lies, and didn't use horrible language. So why is it considered so much more of a problem to be inarticulate than it is to be wholly unethical? Do you think the media talks enough about Trump's horrible performance? Peter, you want to take that first?
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, to be honest, I understand the point. We have, in fact, written quite a lot about the various falsehoods and misstatements and nonsense that he said during the campaign. But it is true that Biden's performance has gotten more attention. And part of it is because, I think people are used to Trump saying things that aren't true and all that. And that he actually didn't do that much in the debate that seemed different. In fact, if anything, he actually seemed
I thought it was better.
Yeah, he was
Definitely.
Yeah.
he was.
I thought it was his strongest debate
He was
performance.
unusually
I did too.
calm and collected, right? And it was Biden's performance that was a shocker, and it's also because, it's not that we make this up, the media makes this up. It's that my phone was blowing up instantaneously from Democrats, not from reporters and not from columnists and so forth. I know that's what the Biden people would like it to make it out to be, a media overreaction. It was from Democrats, his own people who work for him, by the way, people in his administration or campaign who were freaking out. And so we didn't make this up, guys. This is what the Democratic establishment was responding, and we're writing about what they're saying. And I think there's also a sense, a lot of the donors I've talked to and have heard about, they're mad. They're mad at the president and his campaign because they feel like this was a surprise and that it shouldn't have been, and they have been lied to or covered up. And so that is a real problem for the president. Nobody is surprised that Donald Trump doesn't tell the truth, right? Nobody's surprised it might be xenophobic or racist or sexist or all these things, but they were surprised that Joe Biden was having as much trouble as he was because they told us he wasn't. And I think that's
right.
As you probably have, Peter, I've been asked this so many times in the last few days, very similar to other viewers. And my response is, well, as journalists, what we cover are change, things that are new, that are different, that need elaborate. As you said, Trump was Trump. It was bellicose. It was offensive comments about undocumented immigrants. It was just total fabrications, things that were fantastical. But that's no diff. That's Donald. So what are you going to say once you've said all that? What are you going to analyze? That's been for 8 years, more than that. That's been in the conversation. What's different? What is the newsworthy aspect? Is the change in Joe Biden, and that's where the curiosity is.
I don't disagree with the last statement that is newsworthy, but I want to defend these viewers just a little bit to say that sometimes the steady is worth covering, and that it's not just the changes. And so, in campaigns, sometimes when there's nothing happening, media will look for game changers, right? Because we have to cover something. You cannot write the same story every day. We rolled into a town, we got off the plane, he shook some hands, he said hi to the Boy Scouts. He gave the same speech he gave this morning and this afternoon again. And then we got on you can't write that story. Like, I get that. So when something happens, it's different and it's newsworthy. But I think in this case, right, these viewers are saying, sure, maybe everybody knows he lies, but maybe we should document that every time he does.
Well, and they should. And at least all the news outlets, I went through the channels I've been, everybody has talked about, the things that Trump said that were untrue. But then how do you, once you say, well, he claimed that all legal scholars think Roe v. Wade needed to be reversed. Once you said that has absolutely no basis in fact, that's.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
Where do you go from there?
I would add too, that coverage of Biden's issues does not necessarily mean we're saying that Trump is better. Nobody's saying
Right.
that. Like, nobody's saying you
Yeah.
shouldn't measure Biden's issues, serious as they are, as being more or less significant than Trump's issues. And Trump, let's remind everybody, is 78, only a few years behind Biden. He has his own cognitive problems. He has confused names. He has confused dates. He says things that are convoluted and incoherent at times. Now, he does it with volume. I think he covers up in some ways for the problems that he has as that are age-related by bombacity, right? And that gives the impression of energy and vigor that has meant that voters haven't registered that concern with him as much as they have with Biden. Polls show 50% of right? I mean, 50%
Sorry,
of voters
Peter.
say that Trump is too old. 75% or whatever say that Biden is too old.
I was
Yeah.
just thinking about the tremendous amount of coverage that his speech got a week or so ago about the shark and the boat and the electric motor, and that got a tremendous amount of coverage. And so,
yeah, and we will continue to do that, by the way. Don't
okay,
for those
okay,
who think,
fair enough.
right? For those who think we're only focused on Biden, don't worry. We still will be covering Trump and all of the things you're concerned about.
Let's talk about Kamala Harris. We've had many viewers ask about her. And one of the things that we've heard from Republicans in the wake of the debate, well, now it's more clear than ever. If you're voting for Joe Biden, you're really voting for Kamala Harris, because there's no way that man on stage Thursday is going to finish a 4-year term. He's not going to be able to make those decisions to do it over at the end of 4 years. And if Joe Biden was to drop out, of course, Kamala Harris would have to be considered one of the very front runners as the sitting vice president. So, Lynn, my question for you is, first of all, after Biden's performance Thursday, does Kamala Harris factor into voter decision, or is that thinking about 4 years hence not an issue for voters? Secondly, would she have to be considered the front runner, not a Whitmer or Beshear or Shapiro, some of the other governors?
Well, again, so remember the playing field. So for the voters who want to live in the world Democrats want to build, this is not a concern. And the same for the voters who want to live in the world Republicans want to build. So we're really talking about that very narrow slice of people in the middle who could go either way. And it might be one of the things, but that's unsatisfying. But yet we're talking about these elections turning on so few votes that literally anything could be pivotal. So could the choice of Kamala Harris be pivotal? Yes, it could be. Is it going to sway a lot of people? No, there's no way it's going to sway a lot of people. And so both of those things are true at the same time. And, I think that there are things that they could be doing to help allay some of the concerns. I don't see a lot of that happening, but I think there are things they could be doing.
Peter?
Yeah, I'll come to your question about whether what kind of a candidate she would be if, in fact, the president dropped out. I mean, she would be nominally perhaps the front runner because she's a sitting vice president, but nobody's going to defer. Nobody's going to clear the road for her. Unless the president of the United States himself said, guys, I'm going to drop out. We have 5 weeks. I really think you should take Kamala Harris. Maybe that would make a difference. I don't know. But broadly speaking, I think if it's an open nomination, it's going to be a dogfight, and she's going to have to fight hard to win it. And it's not at all guaranteed that she would. Now, she has the advantage of a national, reputation at this point among Democrats. And as we just talked about, with only 5 weeks, you have to go from standing start to a full-blown campaign overnight. And I don't know which of these possible candidates has an organization, a structure, a financial base, or the wherewithal to suddenly translate themselves on the national stage. But she would not be deferred to. And I think all the people you mentioned and others will be in the race.
We have Saul, who asked the question, does the Democratic Party have a fundamental problem with failing to build a leadership transition structure? I just have to say, it seems like parties have that's been with us throughout our history. But Lynn, is that something that the Democratic Party is atypically at this point struggling with?
Not atypically, I would say. I don't think it's any better in the Republican Party. And, you know, Barack Obama was not the guy. If you remember in 2008, that was supposed to be Hillary Clinton's nomination. You know, that's what the maybe party insiders or even people who followed politics thought. And he was this upstart. Who is he? Hasn't been in the Senate very long, and, you know, gave this speech once, and everybody thinks he's great. And he, you know, he's an exceptional candidate, as Peter said earlier, exceptional campaigner. So, you know, this is how it goes. Since we changed the nominating process in the 60s. And I would not say the Democrats are any worse at it than Republicans. I mean, Donald Trump, look at, I mean, was that part of the plan? Like, no.
Well, if anything,
Growth
it was
and
the
Opportunity
anti-plan
Project
that they wanted to keep it from him. Yeah.
And I mean, like, you know, proof by demonstration, like maybe they were wrong, but it was certainly not what they thought the future of their party needed to be in order to win elections. That's the part that is important. Like they did not write, after Mitt Romney lost, a 100-page report on the future of the party with the goal of saying we have to be virtuous. No, the goal was, how do we win these elections? Because people aren't buying what we're selling. And man, they were not right.
I can't believe we're almost at the end of this hour. This has gone so fast. I want to give each of you a chance for a closing message, but just real quickly, I want to get each of your thoughts very briefly. Supporters of the president have thrown out a number of different things for Thursday night and why he had, quote, a bad night. Mary brings up the issue of, and I've seen this written about, Gish galloping, a debate technique that somehow threw Biden off, and he was just unprepared for it. There's a group of doctors wrote something about, oh, he was clearly under the influence of cold medication. Had he not been taking cold medication, he wouldn't have. Peter, does any of that carry any weight, or is just what you expect when a candidate, you know, when supporters see it, they want another explanation?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm looking forward to the memoirs, because there's going to be an answer to this question someday, and they're not giving it to us now. But someday somebody's going to tell us what was happening in the hours and days before the debate, and it will open our eyes and we'll say, aha, there you go. Now, part of it is, remember, he had been in the 23 days before the debate, he had crossed the Atlantic Ocean twice and then flew out to California for that splashy fundraiser with George Clooney and Barack Obama, and then came back to the White House and so forth. So, you know, there's certainly a fatigue, jet lag factor. They did not seem to make him up very well. He looked pallid, right? And the next day you saw him in Raleigh, where he looked pretty robust and pretty tan and healthy. You know, they only showed up at the last minute at the debate studio. They didn't run through it, apparently. I mean, there's lots of things people talk about. And then you hear now the staff coming under fire from donors and even perhaps members of Biden's family thinking, oh, they overstuffed him with too many facts, or, oh, they didn't prepare him well. Maybe. I mean, all of that's possible. But I haven't heard, I mean, I've heard the cold medicine thing, but I don't hear from anybody who actually knows facts. And sometimes you screw up, and he screwed up. And the question is, okay, is it a one-off, or does it represent something more fundamentally troublesome? And that's the real question.
Well, and it just my observation, again, you have so much more knowledge than me, is that, you know, candidates running for office are sick all the time for the very reasons that you mentioned. And they're used to taking cold you know, that's kind of part of a, you know, when you're meeting and greeting the public constantly and traveling the country or the world, you get sick of any age.
I talked to somebody from the Bill Clinton White House the other day who said that Bill Clinton and Al Gore, when they were in the White House, they traded these special tea recipes to protect their voices. They were very conscious about their voice. And Zev may know that, and Mel may know that from their time, obviously, in politics. But I was really struck by that, how much for politicians, preserving your voice is a professional requirement, right? And
well, Pete Wilson, the former California governor, it actually, you know, cost his political career. Lynn, quick comment, and then I want to get to your closes because we're going over time a minute or two here. Sorry.
I was just going to say that all of that just seems like excuse after excuse, because it was the one thing everyone was worried about. And he has had problems with his voice in the past. It's not like that was the first time that has happened. And so the idea that was because of a cold, it's implausible. And so I think the question that everybody wants an answer to is, was it a bad day? or is he truly, this is in a bad way? And I don't know how voters are supposed to figure that out, but I'll just go back to the good news is that with the party so far apart, for most voters, it's the candidate, him or herself, is really not as important as the worlds they want to build.
I want to give you a chance to close, and maybe if this you feel it suits you for a close, sort of, what's the next big thing that you're going to be looking for? Peter, in your case as a journalist, Lynn, in your case as a scholar. Peter, I start with you. What's the next big thing you're going to be paying close attention to for this race?
Well, I think the next week is going to be critical. We're going to see whether or not the donors abandon the president. We're going to see whether or not downstate, red state candidates start freaking out and put pressure on their senior congressional leaders, Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Jim Clyburn, to take action. That's what I think is going to be really critical this week. If he gets through this week, that may mean he survives as the nominee, because then we move, by the way, into Trump's sentencing, which will, of course, change the narrative. We'll be talking about Trump a little bit more, and then into the Republican convention. But it's a fraught moment.
Lynn?
I think one thing that I'll add is that it may be 5 weeks until the roll call, but it is a long time until November. So we have a long way to go until actual election day. And most people will vote before then, but a lot is going to happen between now and then. And one of the things that I am waiting for is, who is Donald Trump's vice president going to be? And I think this choice, if it really is the three people that everyone's talking about, I think if he picks Vance, that is going to be very hard for the Democrats. The reporting sort of suggests like his ego can't really withstand that, because Vance is, attention guy, so maybe he won't do it. But I think that's the worst pick for Biden. And in some sense, Rubio would also be an interesting pick, and would change the shape of the race a little bit, I think. But that to me is the next big.
Any effect on Latino voters? Well, that leaves us for the next time. We'll have to reconvene. Thank you so much for another America at Crossroads, Lynn and Peter. Wonderful to be with you. Thank you for your outstanding questions, viewers. Just as always, a terrific series of questions on what was such a difficult night for the country last Thursday evening. Please support these programs. You've just heard a great example of the quality of guests who bring their thoughts and their deep knowledge of the subjects that we discuss on the program. You can make your tax-deductible contribution at JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. That's the nonprofit that sponsors America at Crossroads, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. There will be no additional program this week because of the Independence Day holiday. We'll be back next Wednesday, which is July 10th. It'll be UCLA-based Middle East scholar Steve Zipperstein on the legal aspects of the Gaza-Israel war. And Steve Zipperstein will be in conversation with Madeline Brand. That's Wednesday night of next week, 9 days from this evening. From all of us, have a very happy 4th of July and a very good night.